Homeless veteran stands trial. Then the judge hears his name, and the courtroom goes silent. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The courtroom was already half full by the time Walter Hayes stepped through the heavy double doors. No one looked up. Not the bailiff, not the stenographer, not the row of attorneys hunched over their files. He moved slowly, his stiff knees resisting each step, the cold metal of the handcuffs clinking softly with every shuffle of his boots. The sound was barely audible, yet to Walter, it echoed like distant gunfire. He wore a coat 2 sizes too big, a frayed wool thing from a church donation bin. His jeans were clean but faded, and his boots, once government-issued, had long lost their shine. Around his shoulders hung not just fabric, but the weight of decades. 2 wars, a collapsed marriage, bureaucratic missteps, and the invisible, unrelenting burden of being forgotten. Docket 82C. The City of Fairview versus Walter Hayes, the bailiff called. A young public defender glanced up briefly, confused. "We weren't assigned this one," she whispered to a colleague. Walter said nothing. He kept his eyes low as they led him to the defendant's table. No family waited in the gallery. No friends. Just rows of strangers checking their watches, waiting for their turn at justice. Judge Eleanor Grant looked up from her docket with a furrowed brow. She was in her early 50s, sharp in both mind and posture. Her eyes scanned the thin case file. A few citations. Trespassing. Disturbing the peace. The details seemed mundane, but something about the name scratched at the edge of her memory. "Mr. Hayes," she began, adjusting her glasses. "You're charged with trespassing behind Westside Coffee on the evening of January 3rd. Do you have legal representation?" Walter hesitated. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "Wasn't expecting anyone to speak for me." "Then you may represent yourself for this hearing unless you wish to postpone." "No, ma'am. I'd rather get it over with." The prosecutor, fresh-faced and newly minted, stood with the confidence of someone who had never once been cold or hungry. "Your Honor, the defendant has been repeatedly warned not to linger behind Westside Coffee. The manager filed 3 separate complaints over the last 2 months. He was found loitering near the rear door, seated beside the trash bins. Police advised him to move on. He refused. Walter didn't flinch. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Hayes, is this true?" He nodded. "I didn't want trouble. It's just that the kitchen vent gives off heat. On cold nights, it helps. Did you ask permission to be there?" Walter glanced up for the first time, his eyes tired but steady. "The cook, Jimmy. He leaves food sometimes. His father served with me." Desert Storm. There was a pause. A crack in the rhythm. Judge Grant blinked. The name, the voice, the war. Something tugged harder now at her memory. She looked down at the file again. In the margin, under a line of faded ink, were scribbled military details. USMC, Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. Retired. Honorable. Her breath caught. Her brother, Jack Parker, had served in the same unit. The courtroom faded around her for a moment. All the clatter and protocol, the cold veneer of authority, it dissolved. In its place, a memory, a folded flag, a graveside rifle salute, and a letter she had read 1,000 times. "If it weren't for Sergeant Hayes, I wouldn't be here to write this. He pulled me out under fire, took 2 rounds, and still laid cover for the rest of the squad. If I ever get home, I want to find him, shake his hand." That letter was the last one Jack ever sent. She looked back up at Walter Hayes. His shoulders hunched, not from guilt, but from the erosion of time and purpose. He had not come to plead or to protest, only to be seen, perhaps one last time, before being processed by a system too busy to remember. "Mr. Hayes," she said again, this time with something softer in her tone. "Is it true you serve in Iraq?" "Yes, ma'am. And before that, Vietnam." "Were you stationed with 2 to 1 during the 2004 Ramadi offensive?" Walter looked up, startled. "I was. How do you know that?" But the judge didn't answer. Instead, she closed the file slowly. "The court will take a 10-minute recess," she said, rising abruptly. Walter watched as she disappeared through the side door. The courtroom murmured in confusion. The bailiff leaned over to him. That's the first time I've seen her call recess mid-hearing. Walter gave a faint shrug. He didn't know what to expect, or if anything had really changed. But behind the judge's chamber door, Eleanor Grant stood shaking. She pulled open a drawer, reached for a weathered photo, 2 young Marines shoulder to shoulder. One was her brother. The other, she wasn't sure. But something in the eyes, the posture. She picked up her phone. Charles, it's Eleanor. I need you to come to the courthouse. Now, bring your badge. Bring your honor. 10 minutes later, when the doors opened again and a man in a sharp gray suit entered beside her, Walter Hayes lifted his head for the first time that morning. And in that moment, the tide began to turn. Not with a bang, but with a quiet recognition. The beginning of remembrance. The beginning of healing. The city courthouse still held the same heavy atmosphere, as if the winter chill outside had seeped through every crack in the walls and every breath inside. Judge Eleanor Grant sat upright on the bench, her sharp eyes scanning the case file like she did every morning. She was the type who followed procedure to the letter, rarely letting emotions interfere with her duties. 2 decades on the bench had molded her into a symbol of discipline, impartial, unwavering. But when she reached the section detailing the defendant's military background, Walter Hayes, her hand suddenly froze. One small line, buried among the bureaucratic print. Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, deployed, Ramadi, Iraq, 2004. Ramadi. Her heartbeat skipped. That name flung open the lid of a memory box she'd kept sealed for 20 years. Like a curtain lifting from the past, an old image resurfaced. Her brother, First Lieutenant Michael Grant, in his Marine uniform, grinning proudly during his unit's farewell ceremony before deployment. The last letter he sent from Ramadi still sat in the drawer beside her bed, the handwriting crooked and weary after battle. In it, he described a brutal ambush. He wrote of a sergeant who'd risked his life to drag him from enemy fire. If it weren't for Sergeant Hayes, he wrote, you'd have already received that terrible news. I owe him my life. The letter arrived 1 week before Michael was killed by an IED. Walter Hayes was the name her family had searched for over the years, but they'd never been able to contact him. Every military record seemed to vanish, as if he'd never existed outside that letter. And now, there he was, a frail man, slightly hunched, eyes sunken from sleepless nights, hands cuffed like a criminal. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying her voice. But when she spoke, she realized it had lost its usual cold edge. Mr. Hayes, do you have legal representation today? Walter looked up, locking eyes with her, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face, as if he sensed something strange in the way she said his name. No, Your Honor. The public defender was reassigned to another courtroom. A long silence blanketed the room. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall, quiet white specks drifting like memories onto the city's shoulders. The door at the back of the courtroom suddenly opened. A middle-aged man in a dark suit entered briskly, carrying a worn leather briefcase. He stopped at the defense table and bowed slightly toward the judge. Your Honor, I'm Charles Banning, volunteer counsel for Mr. Hayes through the Veterans Assistance Office. I respectfully request to join the defense. Walter turned to him, still visibly confused. Judge Grant gave a small nod. Inside her, a storm of memory was raging, but her face remained composed. Granted, we'll take a 15-minute recess to allow counsel to review the file. In the judge's chamber, Eleanor finally let the mask slip. She sank into a chair and pulled an old photo from her wallet. Michael and her at the base, the day he left for Iraq. His brown hair blowing in the wind, his smile bright. She was 30 then, still believing that men like Michael couldn't die. She placed a hand gently on the photo, whispering as if to herself, I found him, Mike. After all these years, he's right there. But he wasn't the same man who once saved her brother. He was now homeless, cuffed, and on trial for doing what he had to just to survive another night. The ache in her chest grew, not just for the memory, but for the truth. Society had failed a man like Walter Hayes. Lost him twice, once in war and once in a life that followed. A knock on the door. Charles Banning stepped in, his eyes cautious. Ma'am, I just asked him a few things. He doesn't remember me, but I served in the logistics unit under Sergeant Hayes in Ramadi. I owe him more than I can ever say. But I don't think he knows who you are. Eleanor tightened her grip on the photo frame. Let's keep it that way for now. Banning nodded. But you should know, if you intend to handle this like any other case, I'd advise against it. This isn't just a disorderly conduct charge. This is a failure of the system, and we both know that. Eleanor said nothing, but within her, a decision had begun to form. No longer a moral dilemma, but a duty, not just to Walter Hayes, but to her brother's memory and to true justice. She rose, adjusting her black robe. Let's return to the courtroom. We'll do the right thing, but we'll do it with dignity. 15 minutes later, Eleanor Grant resumed her seat on the bench. She looked at the worn man before her, not a defendant, a human being bearing scars no one else could see. Mr. Hayes, she began, voice low but no longer cold. Your file indicates you served in Ramadi in 2004. Walter paused, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor. 2nd Marine Division. During an ambush that March, do you recall saving an officer named Michael Grant? A long silence. Walter slowly lifted his head, suspicion in his eyes. Then gradually he nodded. Lieutenant. Took a hit to the leg. I pulled him out of the kill zone. I remember. He wouldn't leave until he knew the others were safe. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Charles Banning stood. Your Honor, I'd like to make a motion, but it may require some time. Judge Grant nodded. But in her eyes, a light had ignited, the light of something about to change. No one in that room knew it yet, but in that moment, the gears of fate for Walter Hayes had shifted. And this time, they weren't turning toward ruin, but rising upward. The courtroom had fallen into an eerie, frozen silence. Walter Hayes sat still, his hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the dark wooden floor, as if searching for a crack to disappear into. Judge Eleanor Grant remained composed on the bench, her hands resting on an open file, but her heart was racing faster with every second. On the page in front of her, the name Walter Hayes sliced through her like a scar. That name was tied to her most painful memory, her brother, First Lieutenant Daniel L. Morgan, who died in combat in Ramadi in 2004. Suddenly, the courtroom doors swung open. All eyes turned to the figure entering, a tall man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, dressed in a finely tailored suit. In his hand, he held a file marked with the logo of a prestigious law firm. Your Honor, I'm Charles Bennett, representing the defendant, Walter Hayes. Walter lifted his head, puzzled. He didn't recognize this man. A voice inside him insisted, I didn't hire anyone, especially not someone who looked this expensive. He glanced toward Judge Eleanor Grant. Her face remained formal, but her eyes held something else, an ache, a compassion rarely seen from the bench. Mr. Bennett, Eleanor said, her voice measured, the court hasn't received notice of any change in legal representation. We received authorization within the last 24 hours, Your Honor, Bennett replied calmly. A former client of mine called and said, there's only one Walter Hayes who saved Eleanor's brother. In that brief moment, Walter looked at Eleanor Grant again. For the first time in years, someone saw him, not as a vagrant or a suspect, but as a man with a name, a history. I request a 15-minute recess to speak with my client, Bennett proposed. Eleanor nodded and struck the gavel once. The court is in recess for 15 minutes. Outside the courtroom, Walter stared at Bennett, suspicious. I don't get it. I don't have anybody. You saved her brother, First Lieutenant Daniel Morgan. Bennett cut in, his tone solemn. She's been searching for you for 20 years. And today, fate brought you face to face with her. He paused. Now it's time to restore the honor of someone who deserves to be remembered. Walter looked away, overwhelmed. But inside, a flicker of something long buried. Hope was reigniting. 15 minutes later, Eleanor Grant returned to the bench. The look she gave Walter was no longer just procedural. It carried weight. Meaning, Your Honor, Charles Bennett began, I'd like to submit a few documents to confirm my client's identity. He stepped forward and placed a special folder on the stand. This includes military records verified by the Department of Defense. Walter Hayes was a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, deployed to Ramadi in 2004. Eleanor opened the folder. Inside was a handwritten letter, faded and dusty, from Daniel. His weary, dirt-stained script still echoed. "Don't worry. Walter Hayes pulled me out of the fire. He shielded me until the last moment." The courtroom remained completely still. A man in the gallery, wearing a USMC pin, stood and spoke in a restrained voice. "I was there too. Walter gave us a way out. We wouldn't have made it without him." Eleanor looked up at Walter, her voice trembling. "Sergeant Hayes, today, as a judge, I can no longer see you merely as a defendant. You are a soldier who saved my brother's life." Walter Hayes sat silently in the defendant's worn wooden chair, his hands resting neatly on his lap. A pale golden light filtered in through the high window behind him, casting a soft morning glow across his weathered face, like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. No one spoke. The entire courtroom was still, as if even time itself were holding its breath. Judge Eleanor Grant slowly rose from a bench. She was no longer the stern figure cloaked in heavy black robes. She stepped down, each movement weighted with emotion. She carried no gavel, no case file, only the quiet bearing of a woman, a sister, now standing before the man who had once saved her brother's life in war. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I once thought I'd never find you." Walter looked up. His old, time-worn eyes, toughened by hardship, now shimmered with a flicker of confusion and emotion. He didn't understand why this woman knew him, or why she was looking at him with such reverence. But then, she raised her hand, a silent signal, and the rear doors of the courtroom opened. 3 uniformed soldiers entered, a colonel, a sergeant, and a private first class. Their dress blues were immaculate, brass buttons gleaming under the courtroom lights. The private carried a polished mahogany case, the Department of Defense emblem carved into its surface. Every eye in the room turned toward them. "Your Honor," the colonel said, his voice deep and resonant, yet solemn and still. "We are here on behalf of the United States Department of Defense to restore the honor of a soldier long overlooked." He turned to Walter. "Sergeant Walter Hayes, United States Marine Corps, for extraordinary bravery and selfless service during the Ramadi campaign in 2004, in which you saved the life of Captain Thomas Grant and 4 fellow Marines under enemy fire. Today, the Department of Defense is officially upgrading your Bronze Star to the Navy Cross, the second highest military honor in the United States." A hushed gasp passed through the room, then silence again as the private opened the case. Inside, the Navy Cross shone under the light, its deep blue ribbon and silver cross gleaming like it had been waiting for this moment all along. The colonel stepped forward and halted in front of Walter. "Permission to restore your honor, Sergeant." Walter rose, slowly, but stood tall, his back straight with the muscle memory of a Marine. As the medal was pinned to his old, wrinkled coat, the courtroom held its breath. No command was given, yet one by one everyone stood. The young prosecutor, the court officer, the observers in the gallery. A man in the back row, a veteran, raised his hand in salute. Then another, and then the entire courtroom lifted their hands in unison, saluting Walter Hayes, the forgotten soldier, now remembered. Walter stood motionless. His eyes were glassy, but no tears fell. He gave a single, slow nod. The emotion rippled through him, felt, not spoken. Judge Grant returned to the bench and gently tapped the gavel. "In light of all that has been presented, both in legal evidence and in conscience, I hereby dismiss all charges against Sergeant Walter Hayes. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel struck like a heartbeat, marking the end of a journey. Not just of a case, but of a life finally coming home. As the room slowly emptied, Attorney Charles Bennett approached Walter. "We got a lot to take care of now, Walter," he smiled. "Veterans housing is being arranged. Your VA records are being reinstated. And the back pay you were denied, 12 years worth, is being processed. Walter exhaled, long, quiet, and full, as if laying down a burden he'd carried alone for too many years. "I don't need much," he said softly. "Just a roof and a chair when the nights get cold." Charles placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've got a whole community behind you now, Walter." Outside the courtroom, a group of high school students waited for their civic tour of the courthouse. When they saw Walter step out, escorted by the 3 soldiers and Judge Grant, a teacher whispered something. Without hesitation, the students stood at attention, hands over hearts, honoring a man whose story they didn't know, but somehow felt. Walter paused. He looked at the kids. And then, in a quiet moment of grace, he raised his hand in a crisp salute. Not out of habit, but because he wanted to salute life itself. At 72 years old, that soldier was finally called by his true name, not vagrant, not disturbance, but Sergeant Walter Hayes, the man who was remembered. 3 weeks had passed since Walter Hayes was restored to honor in a courtroom full of witnesses. Every Monday morning, he would place a kettle on the stove, turn on a small lamp in the corner of his living room, and settle into his worn-out armchair to gaze at the newly decorated wall. At the center of that wall hung the Navy Cross. On either side were official commendation transcripts and an enlarged photograph of Walter in full Marine uniform on the front lines of Ramadi, a restored version of the faded image long forgotten in a storage box. Walter still carried himself like a Marine, neat, disciplined, and reserved. Neighbors greeted him with warm nods as he walked through the apartment complex. Whenever he passed the local police station, young recruits would pause and salute, offering him the kind of recognition that speaks louder than applause. One quiet Saturday afternoon, Judge Eleanor Grant knocked on his door. She wore casual clothes and carried a simple box tied with a deep blue ribbon. "Good afternoon, Sergeant Hayes," she said, no longer with the tone of a judge, but with the softness of a sister visiting her brother. Walter gestured for her to come in. Grant placed the box on the coffee table. "I thought you should read these," she said, opening it. Inside were personal letters written by her late brother, worn, yellowed, and heavy with time. Walter picked up the first one. His voice, low and steady, rose in the still room. "Dear Eleanor, I'm okay. Today was tough, but we made it through thanks to an old Marine in the unit, Hayes. Sergeant Walter Hayes. I thought guys like him only existed in war stories. But today, I stood behind one in battle. You should know that." Walter fell silent. "I remember that day," he murmured. "He was hit in the thigh. I dragged him out. Wasn't sure either of us would make it." Grant said nothing. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "Some people live to remember," she said quietly. "And some people live because they were forgotten. That day, you gave my family something to hold on to in Jack's final weeks." The afternoon drifted by with quiet stories, old letters, and moments thick with human connection. The next day, Walter visited the local VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall. At first, no one recognized him. Then someone noticed the name stitched on his jacket. An older vet stepped forward and clasped his shoulder. "We read the news. It's been a long time since someone truly came home." Walter only smiled. There were no speeches, no ceremonies. Just a quiet soldier returning, to honor, to peace, to the company of those still trying to piece broken things back together. As Eleanor prepared to leave that day, she whispered a quote from one of Jack's letters. "Sergeant Hayes never shouted, never asked to be noticed. But in the darkness, he was the one you trusted most when you were ready to give up." And Walter, in his quiet way, replied, "Not every medal needs a spotlight. Sometimes it just takes one person remembering your name in silence." The story came to a close, but its echo remained. That honor, dignity, and healing often begin with the simple act of being remembered at the right time. In today's world, where a person's worth is too often measured by income, appearance, or fame, the story of Walter Hayes serves as a wake-up call. A veteran who once risked his life under enemy fire to save his comrades. He spent decades in silence and poverty, forgotten by society simply because he no longer fit the modern picture of success. What makes his story truly remarkable isn't just the truth finally coming to light, but how recognition, even when it comes late, can revive a person's dignity and self-worth. Walter never sought glory. He didn't ask to be thanked. All he ever wanted was to be treated as a human being, a man who had served, suffered, sacrificed, and continued to live with quiet dignity. In a moment when the entire courtroom rose to salute him, no one saw a disturbance or a homeless man anymore. They saw a hero. We are often too quick to judge others by appearances, by status, or by the way they carry themselves. But if we took the time to really look, to truly listen, we might discover that beneath frayed clothing and calloused hands lie untold stories of those who once stood in harm's way so that others could live in peace. The lesson in this story isn't about admiring a hero. It's about examining ourselves. How long has it been since we treated others with unconditional respect? How often do we assume that usefulness only comes from those who are young, strong, or wealthy? Walter taught us something simple yet vital, that kindness doesn't have to be grand. It starts with a look that doesn't judge, a gentle question like, "Are you okay?" And most importantly, it comes from remembering, because no one deserves to be forgotten just because they've been silent for too long. If society could pause, even for a moment, to see people like Walter with the heart instead of with bias, perhaps no one would have to wait a lifetime just to be called by their true name again. So the next time we see someone on the margins, let's remember, they may once have been at the very center of a story history never bothered to record. And sometimes just one person willing to listen is enough to bring a life back to light. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.